and I'm going to kick things off. Is everything good? You guys can see the slides and all that?
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you.
Great. And just, feel free to if you have questions or comments or want to discuss as I move through, feel free to break in. It's a small group, and I think we can be pretty informal here. But yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to Michael for having me here and giving me a chance to talk about Open New York, which is something that I've put a lot of work into and a lot of people have, and I care about deeply. So what is Open New York? We're going to have three main sections on this presentation. First, the problem, which you guys are probably aware of some of, but can't hurt to reinforce. Then a bit about who we are, and then what we're doing for the future to help make the world a better place. So to start off with, this is the kind of overall takeaway of this presentation. We're an independent, all-volunteer, pro-housing nonprofit, pro-market rate housing, pro-affordable housing, pro-public housing. If it is a home and people live in it, we are for it. And we are going to end New York's housing shortage. So when I say housing shortage, what am I talking about? I want to start off with this image, which is really one of my favorite pictures of all time because it's weird. It is deeply weird. So this is Manhattan. It's an aerial view. We're looking south. We're roughly above 48th Street or somewhere around there, looking south towards over Midtown, and then you can see Lower Manhattan in the distance. And here's what's weird about it, right, is that human behavior is not predictable perfectly, but it's mostly predictable, and it tends to not have sharp cliffs. So what I mean is, if it makes economic sense to build a skyscraper in Midtown, let's say, in this region, then it probably makes sense to also build a skyscraper over here. And as you can see, that's not what's actually happened. Instead, you've got east of 8th Avenue, 40 to 50-story buildings stretching all the way to the East River. And then as soon as you hit 8th, it's just like a wall. And why is that? And the answer is that we have made it illegal, and for not really a great reason. We've just decided as a civic entity that our highest priority is making sure that the buildings west of 8th Avenue are 4 to 6 stories rather than 40 to 60. And I want to go through kind of how we made that decision, why it's a bad decision, and what we're going to do about it. So this is a chart that's showing housing production in New York City, but over each decade going back to the 20s. And so the 20s were obviously an outlier because we were still filling in Queens and Brooklyn. That was literal greenfield development. They were farmland before that. But even after that, in the 30s and 40s, you had depressed production because of the Great Depression and the war, respectively. But then in the 50s and 60s, we were producing almost 400,000 housing units per year. Now, it drops off after that, right? And the reason for that is obvious. This is the era of the Bronx is burning. This is the era of skyrocketing murder rates. This is the era when New York was losing a lot of population. People were genuinely did not want to live in New York City at the time. And so they moved, and we weren't building a lot of housing, which is fine and makes sense. And then look at what's interesting, though, is what happens in this century, in the 2000s, and especially the 2010s. This is an era of when it is desirable to live in the city again. This is a time when crime rates are at historic lows, when the wage differential between New York City and the rest of the country is much higher than it has been in the past. If you are living in New York City in like the 2010s, you are doing very well relative to the rest of the country. And that was not true in like 1980. But we obviously haven't matched that with actual housing production. New York produced less housing in the 2010s than it did in the 1970s, a time when large chunks of the city were actually on fire, when 1 million people moved out of the 5 boroughs. It's nuts. Like, it is genuinely weird that we're not producing more housing, because going back to this, like, it would obviously be profitable to buy up, like, say, 5 of these buildings and put up a big residential tower like the one you see here. And the reason it hasn't happened is zoning. Zoning, land use, there's a whole suite of policies that inhibit our housing production. I'll go through kind of the specifics of all of them, but like, as a combined regulatory regime, it works to slow down our housing production, and that has some real negative consequences. So let's start with affordability. Over the 2010s, New York gained 500,000 people, and we built only 100,000 homes. This means that rents in the city are incredibly high, which I'm sure all of you already know. This is why looking for an apartment in New York is so miserable. It's why, like, you have to like take a day off and go to and like, you know, show up like 10 minutes early, and like apartments go off the market almost immediately. It's why like a lot of people live with roommates when they don't want to. It's why immigrants and lower income people often like live in unsafe basement units, or, you know, it's a housing shortage that really affects everyone in the city, and it affects people in different ways, right? But it kind of like an unseen gravitational field that's just dragging down everyone's quality of life. And of course, that manifests itself through a racial lens, as well as, you know, most things in our society do. When you're trying to fit more people into a housing stock that's just not growing adequately, then what you get is racial segregation. You get displacement. People who like would want to move into Soho can't afford it and go into the East Village. Someone who now can't afford an apartment in the East Village moves to Williamsburg. Someone who can't afford Williamsburg moves to Bushwick. And it ends with racial segregation or racial displacement. Either way, it's a problem for the city from a social justice viewpoint as much as anything else. And it's obviously a giant problem for sustainability. So right now the city is trying to fit a large number of people who want to live here into a housing stock that is not equipped to handle them. So some of those people, some of that manifests itself in lowered quality of life. People double up, people live in basements, people live with their parents, but some of it manifests itself as people just deciding not to move here. And when they don't move here, they don't just vanish into the ether. They move instead to Charlotte or Atlanta or Houston. And that is a climate catastrophe, because the average New Yorker has a carbon footprint that is 30% the size of the average American. And the reasons for that are obvious, right? I am a New Yorker and I haven't driven a car in 4 months. When I commute, I take the subway or I bicycle or walk. And I live in an apartment which is surrounded on all 4 sides by other apartments, which means that, number one, it's smaller, and number two, it's easier to heat. All the energy I spend in the winter doesn't just drift out the roof. It heats my upstairs neighbor, who then spends less on his heating bill. This is the kind of this is the kind of calculation made over and over and over again that makes New York one of the most sustainable places in the world, in the wealthy world. And we should be letting more people have access to that lifestyle. And doing so would also be better for the city just from an economic point of view. Not just the jobs from, constructing new housing and stuff like that, although those are also significant, but just the raw fact of agglomeration economics. The idea is that when you are in a place where there are more people, you get exposure to more ideas, to more people who are similar to you. There are deeper markets for the things you want. You as a person are better off, and you in turn make others better off just by your presence there. Think about a small town, right? That probably has enough business to support like one restaurant. And that restaurant has to kind of cater to everybody, which means it can't be great at anything. And then you come to New York, and there is a restaurant that specializes in midnight ramen. That is true. This is a real place. They open for seatings at midnight and 1 a.m. on Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And that is their shtick. That is their thing. And like, they're really good at it. I've been there and it's amazing. And that obviously can't exist in Iowa, right? That kind of thing, again, repeated over and over and over for 8 million people, is what makes an economy grow. And we are choking that off by not physically building enough stuff for people to live in. So what are we going to do about it? A lot of people who think this way met up a couple of years ago, and we decided to form Open New York. We are a 501c4 organization, which means we're a nonprofit group, but donations to us are not tax deductible, which allows us kind of more freedom of movement in the political realm. We're not like a political party, but we are allowed to endorse candidates and do some electioneering, as long as it's not like the entirety of our work. And so we've been active for about 2 years. We've built a 1,000-person mailing list. We've got hundreds of donors and dozens of active volunteers on our Slack. Most of our members are under 40, and a lot of them are market rate renters, who are obviously the most hard hit by the housing, or not the most hard hit, but like among the hard hit groups from the housing crisis. And we decide what projects to work on. Pretty much, it's a mix of a democracy and a do-ocracy, I would say. What people are interested in and willing to spend time on is kind of what we're most focused on, with obviously the overall lens being, where can we build the most housing? And specifically, where can we build the most housing in wealthy neighborhoods? So both as a kind of like political, both as a strategic decision to like operate in an environment where, like most people are progressives, and the kind of progressive values are like the strata that New York City operates in. And also, as a like ethical and like ethical decision, Open New York has decided to focus on what we call high opportunity neighborhoods, which are the wealthiest, whitest, most high educated neighborhoods in the core, that are especially located in the core of the city, close to transit. And we feel that these kinds of neighborhoods, which have traditionally resisted housing, are the best kind of opportunities for adding more housing. And I won't scroll all the way back to it, but if you look at that picture of Manhattan again, you'll see, like, if you look at the skyline, you'll see kind of two, like, two tower zones in Midtown and in the financial district. And in between them is a lot of low to mid-rise buildings in some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the world: Soho, Tribeca, the West Village. These are places that could and should easily accept more housing, and they just haven't. Because in 1961, we adopted a zoning code that was entirely too restrictive, but that suited the interests of incumbents and, you know, people who already lived here, at the expense of people who can't move to New York because it's unaffordable. So this is a list of some of the projects that we've worked on. There are two types of things that we do. Some are like specific projects. So like there was someone attempting to build a building at 345 East 33rd Street, which is like Rose Hill area, pretty well off, close to Park Avenue. And the neighbors were complaining because the tower was too tall and it wouldn't be in character with the neighborhood. And we felt that, frankly, that concern isn't really worth listening to. Like, that's not the kind of thing that should be driving a city land use policy, when the decision as to whether or not to build that tower affects the whole city, right? Anyone who's looking for an apartment might look for an apartment in that building, and if it doesn't exist, then obviously that's a problem for people in Brooklyn and Queens as much as it is a problem for, you know, someone who lives across the street. So we worked on East 33rd Street and 80 Flatbush, which is a larger project in Brooklyn, and we've kind of been working our way up the ladder. What our biggest priorities are right now are entire neighborhood rezonings, Gowanus and Soho, which are wealthy neighborhoods and could take a lot more housing, and frankly, really exciting opportunities. Like we've seen kind of growing success as we moved up this ladder of, you know, single buildings to larger buildings to entire neighborhoods now. And we've gotten some notice in like local politics. We're going to be doing some more political work, and we're also doing a lot of public advocacy and education work, trying to get people to understand that why more housing should be seen as a good thing. And I think kind of what I'd love to see the next step would be to statewide action, because there are a lot of state laws that, as well as city laws, that affect how much housing gets built. So there's a current cap on what's called floor area ratio, which is basically like how much of a lot can be covered with floor. So if you cover an entire lot with a 10-story building that has a floor area ratio of 10, if you're only using half the lot, then that same 10-story tower is only a ratio of 5. You see how it works. But currently the state caps that at, I believe 14, although I'd have to go back and check that actually. But there's a cap at at 14, and the state legislature would need to act to do that. And we think that we, in a couple years, might have a shot if we elect a pro-housing legislator or two who's really willing to be a champion on this issue. Citywide, there are parking minimums in New York City, right? It's absurd. This is a city where like the majority of people don't own cars, and where, especially in like dense transit-rich neighborhoods like Long Island City, for example, you would not own a car if you moved to Long Island City, most likely. But the zoning code insists that you are likely to, and that we should build as much parking as you require. When in fact, if we just said, let the market build as much housing or as much parking as it wants, but they don't need to build any extra, then what it would mean would be that people who don't own cars would have cheaper rent, and people who do own cars would be able to buy a space, but they wouldn't be able to free ride off their neighbors who don't. And so that's in a place that's on top of multiple subway lines. It's kind of nuts to be requiring the building of parking when cars are like the least spatially efficient form of transportation. We also would love to see state level preemption of local zoning. So out on Long Island, where you guys are concentrated, there's a substantial transit infrastructure of Long Island Railroad, and around it is usually surface parking lots or single family homes, which is a choice, but it's not a very good one, right? Like, you could build apartments there. It would allow more people to live in extremely expensive towns. It would provide a better customer base for businesses in said towns. It would be a win-win-win for like the climate, for business, for individuals. The people who would lose are people who are bothered by the notion of living next to a 10-story building. And again, those aren't people who should be driving policy. So a quick overview of what we're working on now, which is the Soho rezoning. Soho zoning is outdated, and the city had planned to kind of go in and change things up, just to make stores.
Excuse me?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Hi, Dan. I'm just going to chime in. My name is Sam Bifulco. Sorry I don't have my camera on. I'm just doing a few things on my lunch break.
Oh, no problem.
So I just wanted to clarify, your organization seeks to advocate for state control or allowing the state to supersede local zoning law. Is that correct?
So I don't want to get out over my skis, because this is not like a fully thought out proposal. But generally we believe that land use decisions are better made at a higher level rather than at the local or town level. And that like something like there was a bill in California called SB 50 that would have basically instituted minimum densities around transit stops, especially in wealthy areas. And we think that something like that is a good path forward for New York as well.
Interesting. I mean, obviously, I guess it depends on who you talk to, but, you know, one of the primary focuses of local government, town and counties, especially townships on Long Island, is their ability to regulate zoning. You know, I guess it depends on your philosophy, but, you know, I would think that keeping that decision-making power closest to the people would make sense. You know, I understand NIMBYism. I understand not in my backyard. I understand moving the ball forward and progress. But, you know, when you have residents and homeowners living on Long Island, for the reason of the suburban atmosphere, space, feeling like they're not in a city, they elect their local representatives to reflect that feeling and that sense of suburbanism in the local government and local zoning regulations. So to transfer that power to Albany seems like you are thwarting or potentially disregarding the will of the people as they elect representatives on the local level to make these zoning decisions that best reflect what they want to see.
Right. So I guess what I would say to that is, what about the people who don't live there but would like to? those are like actual humans with actual interests, right? Even though we don't know who they are.
Sure.
Right now, those interests are receiving zero weight. Uh, so that is like that's the argument that I would make, is that like we're not adequately taking into account everyone's interest when we only listen to, look to like people in this like hyper local chunk of Long Island.
Sure. No. That's a great point. Definitely a great point, and it's something worth thinking about. Ultimately, representatives are elected to represent the interests of those they represent, not individuals who they don't represent, right? So it seems as though, I guess, whether we're talking about representatives in Albany or representatives in a local government, we elect them to represent, our views and values. But I guess it's definitely something to take into consideration, as I, open up my horizon on this sort of issue. I obviously know there's a problem.
Sure.
And so it's a matter of how we're going to fix this problem, right? And how we're
No,
going
absolutely.
to address it.
That's why I'm here. I opened that third eye. But I do think that I do want to just stress that I think that like preempting local land use controls does have like democratic legitimacy, right? Like the state legislature was elected by the people, just like the county or township governments, and counties and townships are in the end creatures of the state. So if Albany decides that this would be a good policy and a good in use of the infrastructure which by the way the entire metro area has paid for, right? Like we all pay the taxes and tolls and fees that go to the Port Authority and the MTA, and that subsidize the LIRR. So I don't think that this is some kind of anti-democratic move.
Can I ask about that? Sorry, this is Roger Citron, and
Sure.
I'm a colleague of Michael's on the faculty. Just curious on this. There's a separate question, but just on this immediate point, is there why politically would it come out any differently in Albany? It seems to me that, for example, those resisting are known, organized, and the people who would benefit, in a sense, are diffuse or even unknown. And in legislative politics,
sure.
Why do we think it would come out differently in Albany? I understand the idea of, and I totally accept the, if you will, the legitimacy of this is contested space, or this is space where it isn't just the neighborhoods. But I still wonder about just the political dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's a fair question for sure. And I think that the experience of other states can be pretty instructive here. If you look at places that have had, because there are several places that have had success at this kind of statewide upzoning. Oregon just banned single-family zoning, so now everywhere in Oregon is required to allow accessory dwelling units and a couple other pro-density measures. California as well hasn't fully banned single-family zoning, but has made significant strides towards legalizing accessory dwelling units, legalizing low to mid-rise apartments in a lot more places, and it's done it at the state level. And the reason that it's more politically viable at the state level is that while the people who, when you're fighting on a local level, the deck is just totally stacked against you, right? Because the only people who can vote are the people who would see
the incumbents.
Yeah, exactly, the incumbents. And when you take it up to a state level, they're the Homeowners Association of Long Beach swings a big stick in Long Beach and a much smaller stick in Albany. It like
Oh, I think you froze for a minute.
Thing and more of a like this is a matter of state concern and we should be thinking about it at a statewide level for legislators. And that's proved effective in Minnesota, in Oregon, and even in California. And I think it's the right path here.
Yeah. So okay. It can't be worse. I would admit that, or concede that in a heartbeat. The other question, and I apologize because I've been sort of in and out.
Oh, go ahead.
But of course, the pandemic, and I've heard anecdotally, I actually do live in Manhattan. It's one of the reasons why I'm, on the call or, participating. And I also think the issues are very interesting. Anecdotally, what you hear is the flight, right? That the pandemic's driving people out. And I'm just curious, whether that goes to supply, demand, and possibly even, I don't know, it might create an environment where affordability might become more palatable. And then how do you get there? On the other hand, it might not, because at some point the landlords, it seems like, will say, we're getting, enough is enough. This has been too much. The forbearance is killing us. Anyway, just any of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I can't see, anyone who who claims to know what the pandemic will do is lying, but I don't think that it represents a giant challenge to our worldview, right? Just because even a substantial drop in demand will still leave Manhattan as one of the least affordable places in the United States. Not to mention that in another way, it does kind of reinforce our argument, right? Like the key factor in some of the really terrible death rates that you saw out in Queens was overcrowding. Essential workers living living with multiple roommates in small apartments, and these are people who would probably prefer to live alone or to multiple families sharing one apartment. That's the kind of thing that you can alleviate by building more homes. And I think that I think that in the medium term, New York will probably return to something close to what we remember as normal, right? Agglomeration economics still work, and we can't just shut down every bar in Manhattan forever. And so I think over the time frame we're talking about, which is this is a 10, 20, 50-year project, the pandemic is not going to be a giant stumbling block for us.
No, I think that coupling it with the public health piece, it may really be politically powerful. Exactly. Because once the statistics, just what you said, once the statistics and so on come out about where was, the income inequality issues and and so on, it's going to be staring at us in the face. It already is staring us in the face about the disparity. Exactly. So it could be very powerful politically.
Yeah. So I will just do a very quick spin through of what we're working on now, which is a rezoning of Soho and NoHo. The city had planned to rezone Soho just to legalize some of the retail uses that actually aren't legal now and require a special permitting process that's super cumbersome. And we thought to ourselves, this is one of the richest places in the world, why not build more housing? And so we went to a bunch of public hearings that that were designed to gather input on the retail legalization. And then they weren't talking about housing, and so we decided to write our own plan. Several of our members are like skilled urban planners, land use people, that kind of thing. And we identified a plan that would build 3,400 units on like specific identifiable lots. Under the mandatory inclusionary housing program, there would be almost 700 of them would be affordable. And we kind of successfully injected that into the public conversation. We gathered signatures, proposed this to the community board, which shot us down vociferously, and reached out to a bunch of pro-housing groups, some of which were more kind of traditional affordability. Churches United for Fair Housing, the Housing Rights Initiative, which is a tenants' rights advocacy group, just people like that. And basically made the case to them that your interests will be served by upzoning Soho and the interests of the constituencies you care about. And so we've gotten some momentum. Scott Stringer and Eric Adams have both endorsed rezoning Soho. And just yesterday, Mayor de Blasio announced that he would put it into ULURP, which forced me to hastily rewrite this slide. So apologies for any typo. The fight's not over, but we have showed that even fighting at a local level, as long as you make the case that this is a citywide issue of interest, right? That this again shows if you want to upzone Soho, you can't just rely on Soho residents to do it, because they won't. But if you go to mayoral candidates and say there's been a citywide pattern of only upzoning poor areas, that has stalled out politically as they've gotten more resistant to development. But this is a citywide matter because we're not building enough housing as a city. Then you can start to see the political climate kind of thaw, and we're now in for a fight on Soho. And so for the future, we want to grow and professionalize. We're currently all volunteer, but we're trying to hire a executive director now, actually. And we want to be a player in 2021, 2022. We just completed a successful fundraising drive, although I should note that if any of you feel moved by my presentation, our website is opennewyork.city, and we're still accepting donations. And we think that we can build a large cross-city pro-housing coalition. And just electing, to go back to the California example, just a couple key people can really drive this conversation forward, right? Scott Wiener and Nancy Skinner in California are the point people when it comes to housing. And obviously their crisis is even worse than ours. But they, by electing just a few people who are really willing to write ideas into law, they can kind of shift the whole momentum of the political fight. We would love to do that here. So yeah, that's pretty much my presentation. I appreciate comments and questions, and if anyone else would like to ask something, go for it. Otherwise, this is my contact info.